Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. Good afternoon. I think I can safely say that this is the fullest I've seen this room in more than at least 10 years, maybe a lot longer. So thank you all for coming out. My name, by the way, if you don't know who I am, my name is Eugene Lang. I'm the acting director here at the School of Policy Studies. Welcome to our home, Robert Sutherland Hall, RSH, for the School of Policy Studies, SPS. I appreciate everyone coming out. Before I begin our formal program today, I want to acknowledge that we are gathered on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Reconciliation with Indigenous peoples is a lifelong journey for us all, and as part of that journey, we should reflect on where we are today. It's my great pleasure to introduce the 2025 Matthews Lecture. This annual lecture series was made possible by a generous gift given about 20 years ago by the late Donald Matthews. Donald Matthews was a highly successful Canadian businessman, a Second World War veteran, an advisor to Ontario Premiers John Robarts and Bill Davis, and a graduate of this university. And it's owing to the generosity of Mr. Matthews and his family that we were able to put on this lecture today. I'm going to now introduce our lecturer today. Needless to say, introducing Bob Ray is a daunting task because the life and career are so enormous and so consequential. And it's even more daunting for me because I've known the man for 2 decades, so I know some things that are not in the official biography, as it were. And I have to be careful that I don't disclose certain state secrets, if you will. But if you will indulge me for a few minutes, I will try to hit on what I think are some of the historically important peaks in the mountain range of a career that he's had. So Bob, of course, was the 21st Premier of Ontario, elected in 1990 at the ripe old age of 42 years old, and he served in that role for about 5 years. He had the misfortune, however, of coming to power during one of the worst times economically in the history of the province of Ontario. Just to remind people with a few statistics, we are in a university after all. 10% unemployment, 6% inflation, 9% interest rates at that time. It was not a happy time in the province of Ontario, and his government governed as well as it could be expected to govern, or as any government did at the time under those circumstances. And though that government, his government, was focused largely on battling the brutal recession of that period, they also made significant strides in areas such as employment equity, race relations, and social housing. The Ray government built more social housing during its time in office than any government in Ontario's history. And if we didn't know how important social housing was 35 years ago, we sure as hell know how important it is today. About a dozen years before becoming Premier, Bob was a federal New Democratic Party Member of Parliament. Now this is an interregnum in his career that's often overlooked, but it's not unimportant. Notably, he authored and moved the non-confidence motion that defeated the Clark government in 1979. I recall Bob telling me years ago, he said that in those days, he was very young, of course, he was basically a teenager. And he said to me, Pierre Trudeau and Marc Lalonde used to call me Junior in those days. Well, Junior moved the motion that ended the Clark government and triggered a chain of events that led to Pierre Trudeau winning a rather implausible 4th mandate. And of course, it's the 4th mandate that we all remember because that's when we got the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Something to think about. More than 30 years later, in a kind of an odd set of circumstances, Bob became interim leader of the same party that Pierre Trudeau once led. This was after the 2011 general election, when the federal Liberals were reduced, you might remember, to third-party status in the House of Commons. As interim leader, Bob played a key role in preventing Canada's Liberals from going the way of the British Liberal Party, which after the First World War was basically reduced to permanent third-party status. And I don't think he gets enough credit for that.
Neither do I.
No, I know you don't. That's why I mentioned it. That's why I mentioned it. All told, Bob was elected 11 times, federally and provincially, over his long electoral career. He's done a lot more than sit in legislatures, and throughout his entire career, he's been sought after by governments in Ottawa and in Queen's Park for his intelligence, his judgment, his wisdom, his sensitivity, and advice on issues as diverse as the Air India disaster, post-secondary education reform, and how Canada should approach the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, among many other critical issues. And in 2020, Bob was appointed Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, a position that he left just a few days ago, told me he drove back, which struck me as a bit odd, drove back from New York to Toronto where he lives. And by the way, he is, according to my calculation, the second longest serving United Nations ambassador in Canada's history. So let's give him a round of applause for that. More importantly than the tenure, though, was the quality of his time in New York. I think he was an exemplary ambassador and frankly set a new bar for the role through what he did, said, and led at the United Nations, including being elected president of the UN's Economic and Social Council. Bob is also, he wears many hats. He's also a teacher and a scholar, having taught for many years, I think decades in fact, I guess what we might call the other place, the University of Toronto, and having written 5 books. I don't know, I have a hunch there's probably a 6th book in the works right now, but I can't confirm that. Maybe he will confirm that. A lawyer by training, he did his BA and his law degree at the University of Toronto, and an MPhil at Balliol College, Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar and studied under the great philosopher Isaiah Berlin. And if you read any of Bob's books or you listen to his discourse, you will hear or see the influence of Berlin, I think, on his thinking to this day. The question, of course, is, I'm going to pose this question to you, is whether Bob is a fox or a hedgehog. For those of you who know your Berlin, you will know that reference. I'm going to read you 3 sentences Bob wrote in 2017 that might give us an answer to that burning question. And I quote, "I doubt Donald Trump has read much Hegel, or Isaiah Berlin for that matter. But the blustering nationalism he now champions runs contrary to everything America has stood for in the world. Other countries will have to counter what he is doing and saying by insisting that pluralism, openness, and embracing the dignity of difference need to lie at the core of international politics." End quote. No, I think that is more fox than hedgehog, but we can have a debate about that. All that said, I happen to know, however, that Bob's favorite author is George Orwell, who has inspired the title and the theme, I think, of his talk today. And incidentally, when I invited Bob to come to Queen's a number of weeks ago, I asked him, is there anyone at the university in particular you'd like to meet with? And his answer to me was, the principal. He's an Orwell scholar. So these 2 Orwell geeks just had a half-an-hour meeting up in Richardson Hall where I guess they got their full Orwell on. So anyway, those are some of the, I think, big peaks in the mountain range of this career, but most importantly, I wanted to say, Bob has remained grounded through all these big jobs and accomplishments that he's had over 4 or 5 decades. He has a great sense of humor, which you've already seen evidence of. And I would say, unlike most of our politicians today, he doesn't take himself too seriously all the time. I remember about 20 years ago, Bob might or might not remember this, being at an event at the late Mike Robinson's home when Bob was running for the federal Liberal leadership, and where a bunch of Ray acolytes and disciples, myself included, were gathered. And Bob offered some impromptu remarks to his troops to encourage them for the coming battle. And he said, and I quote, "Don't worry, folks, we're going to win this thing. You have to understand, I've been a rising star for 5 decades." I think that about sums up the man for me. So please join me in welcoming the 2025 Matthews Lecturer, the Honourable Bob Rae, the best Prime Minister Canada never had.
Thank you, David. I would just say the best Prime Minister Canada never had yet. So add 2 more decades to the 5. That was 20 years ago. So, Jean, thank you very, very much for that warm introduction. It's much appreciated, and I'm very, very proud to be the Matthews Lecturer. I think Don Matthews, who I knew, who was a firm supporter of Mr. Davis and Mr. Robarts before him, I don't think he'd be totally displeased with the fact that I'm standing here. I knew him as what I would call very much a Tory centrist in the political culture of that time. My great friend Charles Pascal, who's Deputy Minister of Everything when I was Premier, used to say about Mr. Davis that he was the last socialist Premier of Ontario. And then he would look right at me and said, "Yes, I mean Bill Davis." I said, "Well, that's because he had some more money to play around with than I did." But seriously, it's wonderful to be back at Queen's. If you go outside, you'll see some pictures of me in another era talking to students, and it was a great privilege and pleasure to come here as often as I have. As I said to Principal Dean, I didn't get into Queen's University when I came to university. I went to mainly because my brother and sister had come here, and University College made me an offer that I just couldn't turn down at U of T, so I didn't come. But I've been back many times since and have tried to make up for the fact that I was not an undergrad. And I'm very, very honored to have received an honorary degree from the university, thanks to Principal Watts, who was so kind to me, a great scholar of federalism, who was truly one of my mentors and good friends. And I was so pleased to be able to come here and speak at that time. Speaking of friends, another friend, Art Milnes, who some of you will know, a local historian and remarkable individual, of course, heard that I was coming and said, "Did you know, of course, that today is Laurier Day?" So it is Laurier Day. Apparently, it's Wilfrid Laurier's birthday. And he reminded me that Wilfrid Laurier gave a great convocation speech at Queen's University when he received an honorary degree, when he made it clear that he'd rather receive an honorary degree from Queen's than either Oxford or Cambridge. So there you go. He also said, and it's a reflection of the time, I won't read you the full quote of his speech, but he said that when he was speaking to this audience, of course it was a convocation, so it was all pretty well all students, that he was speaking to the future generation, and he was speaking to the future men who would make such a difference in society. I don't know how the women felt who were sitting in the audience, but nevertheless, he was talking to the future generation. And I think it's good to see so many students here today, and it's also appreciate people here who are of, if I may say so, of my generation, who I think it's important for us to come together and have an intergenerational dialogue about the state of the world today. I'm delighted to see Keith here. Keith Banting and I'm not sure Keith would admit to this, but Keith and I were both guides in Parliament in the summer of 1966. And he was a better guide. He was a better guide than I was, but he was great. He was one of the pros there. And on a serious note, I have to say that I regret that somebody I know who would have been here if he had been able to to live longer was Tom Cruikshank, for whom I had the greatest affection and respect. I first met him when I was a young MP, and he was a young professor from Western, and we did battle about the issue of interest rates and what was happening to the Canadian economy. And unlike many, Tom came over to me afterwards and says, "You're wrong about this, you're wrong about this, and you're wrong about this, but let's keep in touch." And we did, and we did. And he was such a battler for ideas and for good public policy, and was so open to talking to people and engaging with people. And I'm sorry that he's not still with us, but I think we're all been affected and helped by his commitment to public policy. And finally, I'm delighted that the principal is able to join us briefly. I know he has to go to yet another meeting. Sounds and feels like the UN to me. You know, the UN, you consist of coming into the beginning of a meeting, leaving in the middle, and then going on to the next one. So I understand the pace and the dialogue. And finally, let me just say to Jean, I really do appreciate the introduction. Very, very generous and very kind. And pretty accurate, really. If I could probably have beefed it up a bit, but it was certainly covered the waterfront in many different ways. In thinking about today's remarks, I thought I would try something which is kind of dangerous because it involves sort of thinking on my feet a bit, although I do have some written notes, I want to assure you. But I wanted to try to weave a couple of thoughts, and I have to say, Principal Dean, as he always does, this got me with a very, very cogent comment as we were talking about what's happening in the world and about the topic for today. And he said, you and I, talking to me, we're almost part of the same generation. And I'm a baby boomer, born in the late 40s. For those of you who are still doing your calculation, I haven't hit 80 yet, but I'm heading there. But my one piece of advice to everybody in the room is, I asked Ed Mervish when he was at his 90th birthday, Ed, what's the secret of your success? And he said, keep breathing. And I think that's a good piece of advice that all of us should take as we think about, what am I going to do next? And I was reflecting to some people last week, talking to some students in New York, and I said, many of you will be thinking about what you're going to be doing after graduation. And you don't know whether you're going to get a job, you don't know whether you're going to find work, you don't know whether you can do the things that you're being asked to do, and you're coming to grips with a world that's changing quickly, and it's a field of great uncertainty. And I said to them at that time, I said, look, I'm 77, I'm about to lose my job, I don't know what the future holds, and I wake up with the same questions that you do. A little differently, perhaps, because there are many safety nets behind me and that I can rely on. But nevertheless, we all need to understand that there are moments of choice that we make in life, and the choices don't stop. They just keep on going. And we all have to see life that way, as how and why we make the choices that we make, and why it's so important for us to be embedded in a couple of basic principles. One is a profound sense of values, and of the importance of integrity and old-fashioned virtues, integrity, humility, truth-telling, and be humble at all times. And that's difficult for people like me because I've been the center of a lot of things over my life. And the second is to really, really embrace not only the idealism, but embrace the spirit of pragmatism. Try to do what you can do every day. Try to set out the ways in which you can succeed and look at it in that kind of a spirit. I say this to you because Jean raised the question of, well, am I a fox or a hedgehog? And some of you may not know what that's all about, because what Sir Isaiah Berlin was doing in this great defense of pragmatism was saying there are really two kinds of people. Well, I used to say to him, well, actually, there are two kinds of people. One is the kind of person who thinks there are two kinds of people, and the other one who doesn't think there are two kinds of people. That's the kind of people there are. So he laughed, sort of, but he did have an influence on me, and I can still hear his voice very clearly in my own mind's eye as I reflect on things. But Berlin, I'll do this one thing, because Gene's given me a bit of leeway in terms of time. Here I am, a young student, 21 years old, a cold morning in Oxford, no central heating, by the way, none, zero. Going to a seminar with two people, me and Joe Femia, who later became a great Gramsci scholar, and we were going to have our first tutorial with Isaiah Berlin, which was kind of daunting for both of us. And Berlin made us, we sat down, and Sir Isaiah was very charming. He spoke in a way that I can't quite imitate, but I'll try to. But just say that early in the morning, on a Monday morning, his voice was like a car starting in the morning. Now, this is before cars started the way they do now, okay? This is a different kind of car. This is like car. So he had a very English accent, and he swallowed all his words. So you could very hard to understand what he was saying. So he said to me, "Mr. Ray," "Yes, sir, yes, sir." You know, he said, "Well, what do you think about this carpet?" And there was a carpet between us and him as we were talking across a table. And I said, "I don't know, the carpet, it looks very nice." And said, "It must be a Persian carpet. It looks very pretty." He said, "Yes, Persian carpet, yes." "What do you think about it? What do you think? And I said, "I don't know." I felt really stupid. "It's female, what do you think?" No take. Joe couldn't quite understand what he was saying. In fact, I can't tell you what he said afterwards in terms of what he couldn't understand a word he said, but he said it much more in a New Jersey kind of way than that. And so Berlin said, "What do you think about the car?" I said, "Oh, okay, I'll tell you. See the carpet? There's a pattern." Yes, there's a pattern. I see that. "And what do you think about the pattern?" I said, "I don't know." He says, "Everything fits." I said, "What?" He said, "Everything fits. Everything fits." And he said, and I won't do the rest of the invitation because you get the feeling for what it was like, but he said a very simple thing. He said, there are people who believe that everything in life fits. There are many people who always tell me something, they say something happened, he says, everything happens for a reason. I don't agree. I don't agree with that point of view because my life experience is not the same. And then he said, you need to understand one thing. There are people, and here he was talking about hedgehogs, who believe in one thing and know one thing and believe that one thing explains everything. So in a carpet pattern, if there's nothing missing, then that is somebody who's trying to tell you everything fits in the pattern. Or you believe, and he said, as I do, and as I eventually came to see the logic of, and also the passion of what he was saying, is that not everything fits. And so you need to understand and grasp the fact that pragmatism is not the abandonment of principle. Pragmatism is the implementation of principle. Sometimes people say, are you a pragmatist or are you an idealist? And I say, I'm both. And I would even say, with respect to the hedgehog and the fox, sometimes we make distinctions which, when you follow them through logically, don't always fit. So I'll just leave that thought with you. The title of this talk is about my attempt to link up the person that I consider to be one of the wisest and most profound political writers and thinkers of the 20th century and into our time with the life that I've been leading over the last 5 years. So this is going to be complicated and a little bit like trapeze artist. You hope that you hope and pray that he grabs onto the next trapeze. But just follow on from what I've said. First of all, a little bit about Orwell, for those of you who are not Orwell fans or scholars. Born in India, father was a drug dealer. What? Yes, he was a drug dealer. He was responsible for the opium trade in a small district in northeastern India. And Orwell was sent home from India to go to school, as was often the case. And Having graduated from Eton College, he then made his way back to India, as Burma was at that time, to be a police officer in Burma. And that began his story, his life as a writer and his life as a thinker and a political actor. And without getting into all the details, suffice it to say that Orwell's life and writing was really about 5 or 6 big ideas and themes, which I will talk about a little bit in my engagement with the United Nations and the world over the last 5 years. The first idea is the problem with empire, and the fact that there are so many abuses associated with empire that we have to understand how difficult a legacy is left by empires. And we are all the product of empires in one way, shape, or form. And yet imperial reality has created enormous problems for the world, and problems that Orwell was living with in his time and others are. He said this in a sense from the inside, because he was a police officer in Burma whose job it was to enforce the discrimination, the racism, the exploitation that he then came to realize was part and parcel of colonialism. So that's lesson 1. I'll talk about that a little bit. Lesson 2 is that as he left Burma and then went back to England, he then decided to become a writer. And in so doing, he had to rebel against his family, who thought writing was a complete ridiculous thing for anyone to aspire to be. And so he then decided to cut himself off as much as he could from the background that he had. Now, we all know we never successfully release ourselves from our background. I've learned this myself. My father said to me when I was leaving university, he said, maybe you should think about diplomacy. And I said, no way. I'm going into politics, I'm going to do this. And he said, fine. And unfortunately, he passed away long before I was able to succeed him in the job that he did 50 years ago. And he would be rolling with laughter at the thought that I would be saying, oh, okay, I'll take that job. That's an interesting job. But I say this because in looking at the world as he saw it, Orwell in the late 1920s and 30s was living in a country, United Kingdom, that was undergoing a profound social change, in which millions of lives were disrupted by the huge economic challenges that followed the end of the First World War. So as the First World War was ending, Britain never really got back in its stride, back on its feet. Always millions of people unemployed, millions of people displaced. And so that's what led to his great books on poverty, where he wrote books about displacement and poverty in Paris and London, and also his famous book on the road to Wigan Pier, where he started to become more of a political writer and more of a socialist, and see how that would work. And that became his lodestar, but he was a very different kind of socialist. And he became an even more different kind of socialist when he went to Spain. When he went to Spain, he didn't fight and work for the Communist Party, which most of the people who went to Spain as volunteers ended up doing. He went to work for a small socialist group called POUM. And he then realized that the communists actually hated him and what he was representing as much as they hated Franco. And so his politics were changed. He was forced to look at the world in a different way, in which he saw that what people thought of as, quote, the left, or where progressive thinking was going, was actually deeply oppressive, used propaganda, lied a ton, and said things that were profoundly untrue. And all this comes out in the book Homage to Catalonia, which was really his political awakening. And as time went on, I'm not going to go through the full biography, he then went on later to write Animal Farm, which everyone knows is a great allegory of what happens when revolutions go wrong, which they always do. And then 1984, which, as I said, many people now look to 1984, maybe it's a guidebook or a recipe book or something. Let's learn from that and see how we can do things. But 1984 was a description of a world in which great powers form blocks, in which those powers think that the world is theirs to be divided up between them, and in which they will use whatever techniques they can to try to control the population through a political party and a structure which is totally corrupt and dictated by one dictator, Big Brother, and in which the techniques of Big Brother are all based on lying, propaganda, thought control, and language control. Well, hey, what do you think? That's why when I say, when you read this book, of all the political writers that one reads from the 20th century, Orwell is the one that really speaks to us today. Because the world he was trying to go through and live through is the world we are dealing with now. He didn't know anything about what we would call social media. He didn't know anything about artificial intelligence. He didn't have all the things that we now see around us as defining our political and economic universe, but he imagined such a thing. And in imagining it, he gave us a sense of warning about how we have to fight against this potential future. And I'm arguing with you that this is why we need to fight against the forces at work in every society that are taking us down a path that we should not be going down. And we're telling the truth and trying to live democratically and trying to live with humility and trying to practice things pragmatically and understanding that there are limits to power at all times and need to be limits to power, and there have to be ways in which we deal with that problem at every instance is in fact the opposite of what we're seeing in many, many countries. Not just a few, not just the Soviet Union of the 1930s and 40s, but in every society there are these terrible tendencies that we need to deal with and we need to fight against. So I'm appointed ambassador to the United Nations. Soon after, I worked for Mr. Trudeau briefly on the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar. So, Burma. So my Burmese days started in 2017. And I discovered, I know that Patrick knows this book, but I discovered when I got to Myanmar, I was in a little bookstore, and there was a book there by a woman named Emma Larkin, and the book is called Finding George Orwell in Burma. And I commend it to you because it's a brilliant book. Emma Larkin is like George Orwell, whose real name was Eric Blair. Emma Larkin is a pen name. And to this day, I don't know who she is. Apparently she's an American journalist who lives in Bangkok, but I've never met her. But she wrote two great books about Myanmar. One is called No Bad News for the King, and the other one is this book about Orwell. And in coming to grips with the situation in Myanmar, it proved to me more than anything that what Orwell was describing as his relationship to the country was something that was being lived out every day, because Myanmar, Burma, became a military dictatorship very soon after independence. The leader who led the country to independence was a military leader whose name was Aung San. Aung San's daughter is Aung San Suu Kyi, who's now in a prison in Burma. So Aung San's motto was Burma for the Burmese, which many people thought meant, well, instead of the British or the Japanese. So it was an expression of nationalism that was part of the independence movement that was in play. But actually, what Burma for the Burmese meant to people living in Myanmar was a statement by the Bamar group, who were the central, the country, the people who lived on in the Irrawaddy Valley, who were the central, sort of saw themselves as the central peoples, if you like, the same way that English Canadians for many years, I think of Queens in those days, saw themselves as Canada. And then we've had to realize that, well, actually Canada means a whole lot more than just Upper Canada. It means all of the diversity that we see around us every day and all of the tensions and issues. And so but that Burma for the Burmese really meant to the people living in the hills around the valley, who are actually the majority of the population, it really meant that Burma was not for them. And by the way, the people who expressed the central values of Burma was the army. The army was the protector of the country. The army was the central institution that was the core to the country, and therefore everything else about the country, like democracy and everything else, was, not important. And so Aung San, as many revolutionary leaders, was assassinated along with half of his cabinet in an attack on the government in 1949. And Aung San Suu Kyi had to leave the country with her mother. And so there was a whole recognition that life was being transformed around them as the dictatorship took on more and more and more power and control under the army. And there was fighting that went on in Myanmar starting in 1950, and it never stopped. It has not stopped until now. It is still going on today. There is a civil war underway in Myanmar. So one of the groups that was the most sort of displaced, if you like, by this central ideology of the country is for us, we are the country, and the army is the country, is a group of Muslims who lived in the northwestern part of the country called the Rohingya. And the Rohingya were never accepted by the regime as being real Burmese. They were not, in the view of the regime, they were not really members of the community. Don't forget that under the British Empire, there was no border between India and Burma. So Burma became instantly, under the British Empire, a cosmopolitan country with millions of people from India, Muslims, Hindus, everybody there. The Buddhist culture of Myanmar, they felt, the nationalists felt this whole culture of ours is being destroyed by all these foreigners, all these outsiders, these people who look differently and cook differently and think differently than we do. We got to get rid of them. So one of the first things they did was to start a process of displacement of all these people, push them back to wherever they came from. That's where they're being pushed back to. And the last group to be finally said, this is a group we've really got to get rid of, the Rohingya. And when in the, second decade of the 21st century, the military regime began to feel horribly vulnerable to what was happening around the world, they embraced an opening of the country. And people thought, this is great. And they embraced the internet. And people said, this is going to be wonderful. The internet is going to produce great ideas, great research. It's going to be like a library somewhere in the sky that everybody can consult with. Of course, the most popular platform in Myanmar was Facebook. So Facebook became not a center of learning. You'll be shocked to learn this. Not a central learning of dialogue, of civility and understanding, of sort of liberal heaven where everything will get better and there'll be dramatic improvements in the lives of people. No. This is not, John Stuart Mill with a typewriter. That's not what this is. This is a very different situation. It became a cauldron of hatred and racism and brutal naming of the Rohingya, and it was used by fanatical nationalists to whip up hatred and spread rumors and lies about who the Rohingya are. And there were a series of forced displacements, and the most dramatic of them was in 2017. And at the point at which that happened, Mr. Trudeau called me up and said, "Do you know anything about Myanmar?" And I said, "Yeah, I know a little bit about it. I've been there on behalf of the Forum of Federations. It's an organization that started a few years ago." I said, "We've done some exploring in that country. I know a little bit about it." He said, "Good. I need you to help me with something." And, when I get calls from the Prime Minister like this, I sort of say, okay, not really knowing what the path is going to be, where it's going to take me, how it's going to go. And it led me to a journey of discovery, and for those of you, I'd say this particularly to the students, never turn down an opportunity to learn something new. Like, never turn it down. You might say, "I don't know what that's going to, I have no idea. I've never been there before." I have students who say this to me, "I'm sorry, Professor, I can't do this because I've never done it before." I said, "Well, no one else has done it either, so you better start doing it because you're going to have to learn it." And that's how you learn. And you learn by making mistakes. I once asked an Israeli businessman, "How do you decide who you're going to hire when you're near startup companies?" And he said, "Oh, that's easy. I start with people and I ask them in their first interview, what have you tried and failed at?" And if people say, "Well, I've actually never failed. My life has been just one long stream of success and I've never had a failure." He said, "I'm not interested in those people because they have not learned how to fail and they've not learned anything from their failure. So I don't want them to figure that out when they're 45 working for me. I want to know that they failed." So I know this professors here will not like me saying this, but go ahead and fail a bit, just screw up a bit, and you'll feel better in the end because you'll learn something from that experience. So when the Prime Minister asked me to do this, I took it on right away and went immediately to this refugee camp. And it was something. It was troubling to see 800,000 people suddenly. Imagine 800,000 people, right? We're talking about half the population of downtown Toronto, not the mall that Toronto area has become, but it's a lot of people. But they're not living in housing; they're living in tents, they're living in shacks, they're living in shelters, and they're living on hills that are extremely vulnerable to monsoons and weather, and the whole area was deforested, just unbelievable situation. And so you really look at this, and I realized right away that this is it. This is the world for a lot of people. This is not what many of us think of as what's it like out there. And you say that it's very, very difficult. Life is very, very hard for most people. It's hard for all of us. Life is hard anyway. As one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Zhivago, which is one of my favorite books, that Boris Pasternak says, "Life is never an easy walk across a field." Don't believe anybody if they say it's all a breeze. It's never an easy walk. And so we needed to get people to understand this issue. And as I did the report for Mr. Trudeau, and had a whole bunch of meetings and went back to the camp many times, met with people here, or a Rohingya here now living in Canada, it opened me up to saying, well, this is really interesting. And then he called me out of the blue and said, "I'd like you to come to Ottawa because I've got something else I really want to talk to you about." And that's when he offered me the job of being the ambassador of Canada to the UN. And based on the experiences that I'd had with the Rohingya, I said, okay, but I want to continue to be able to speak out on refugee issues. And he said, good, we want you to be able to speak out. We want you to be able to, and I learned later that all of the people in Global Affairs Canada were appalled that the Prime Minister had given me this much license to say and do things. They said, holy crap, you know what you've just done. In fact, after the first year of being a diplomat, they sent me a little plaque that said, Hurricane Bob, which was a fascinating experience. So very quickly, because I know I've taken a lot of time, but I just want to say a few things. The experience at the UN really demonstrated to me that so many of the issues that Orwell described in all of his writing meant so much to me in the work that I was doing. And I would go back and reread and read again and think through what his life was about and how it was so relevant to the world that we were facing, the world of displacement, except the displacement was not just the world in southern England, but it was the displacement that's happening globally. And so we're living in a world in which literally hundreds of millions of people are on the move all the time. And my friend Naomi Alby knows this very well because, again, a deputy minister in the Ray government. And Naomi's done so much work on this issue of migration and integration and how we celebrate and how we make sure that the country is able to evolve our country to deal with the concept of this world. And then the question of looking at facts and understanding that facts and truth actually matter. That it's not true to say we live in a post-truth world in which everything is relative or not important. We live in a world in which we need to embrace and understand the importance of science. So when we were presented, as we were the other day, not that long ago, by a long discourse by President Trump, even longer than the talk that I'm giving now. And he said, there's no such thing as climate change. And he went on the riff that he does about windmills and, solar energy and there are no batteries and, the world in which he's living, right? I can only imagine what the interior of that brain is actually like. I'd love to see that MRI. I mean, it would be such and I gather at Kingston they're getting a couple of new CAT scan machines. It's going to be amazing as we try to understand what's going on there. But I can say these things now that I couldn't say even a week ago. But look, I mean, climate change it's a crisis that is just like the proverbial frog on the stove. I mean, it's like you just heat it up a bit and so far it seems okay. It's sort of like the guy who jumps off the top of a building and he's going down and somebody says, "How is it?" And he says, "Okay, so far it's going okay. Not a problem." And we need to understand that climate change is that kind of crisis. It's global. It is only global policymaking that can actually impact climate change. It's not just local or national, although that's required, but it's genuinely global. COVID, which hit me when I was in New York in 2020. COVID is a pandemic that doesn't actually know borders or boundaries. You can't stop it at Alexandria Bay and say, we've got a solution for this thing, and it's not going to affect us. You can't do that. And we globally desperately tried to figure out how can we isolate ourselves from the impact. And it was not successful. And we need to understand the consequences of how we responded to that crisis was truly devastating for so many people and for so many parts of the world. But again, what I experienced in New York was the gap between what Ottawa was saying and doing and what we were facing in New York. Because for Ottawa, the crisis was Canadian. And every day the Prime Minister would come out and talk about this and what we need to do and how we need to. And once a New Democrat came to see me, and they still come to see me and talk to me sometimes, but when she's saying, I said, she was complaining about, our foreign policy in different ways, and I said, I understand completely. How many questions have you actually been able to get on question period on the fact that we are vaccinating Canadians, but while we're vaccinating Canadians, billions of people are unvaccinated in the world? And she said, well, it's difficult to do that, because my constituents want. And I said, yeah, exactly. So that's the challenge that the government faces. If constituents are not raising the question of where the impact is of what's happening globally, there we have it. Two other things I just want to mention, three other things mismentioned. Actually, at this point, four, but I'll try to keep it down. Afghanistan revealed, I think, the dangers and risks of what I call impulsive decision making. There were two impulsive decisions made about Afghanistan. Well, there were several. First, there was an impulsive decision to go in, which was made in response to the horror of what happened at 9/11. And Canada participated in that and fully engaged in it. It was a powerful expression of our determination to work at what we thought was a noble cause and what we felt that was necessary for us to be able to respond to a particular crisis of terrorism. We can all talk about that, but we can also talk about the fact that once you go in, you can't just say, "Oh, we've had enough of that. We're done. We've done our bit. Time for us to go." And then for us to say it was one thing, and then to reduce our commitment, and then to reduce our presence, but then for the Americans to do the same has proven to be absolutely catastrophic in terms of the consequences. And although one president might blame another president, the fact is everyone shares responsibility for this. No one can go away and say, well, we have nothing to do with it. We did, as Canadians, have something to do with it because we left too. And the first crisis, apart from COVID, that I faced was Afghanistan, was the collapse of civil order in Afghanistan, and literally the movement of thousands and thousands of people who were determined to get out, and our efforts to say, okay, we'll respond to that and bring people here, which we did in a remarkable way compared to virtually every other country. We were way, per capita, we did way more than most other countries. But the point about all of these things is whatever you do has to be sustainable. It has to be persistent. It has to be able to be sustained in a consistent way. And I think when we look, for example, in terms of our domestic policy and how we're treating international students in Canada, I would have to say it's been disgraceful, the way we have just reacted impulsively to various, what we say is a move in public opinion, when in fact you've got to look at these things not impulsively, but consequentially. And one of my main lessons in public policy is exactly what I've just said. So I'm going to say it again. We all make the mistake of thinking and acting impulsively. But that is no excuse when we know, in fact, that the consequences of that can be so disastrous. And one of the problems we face increasingly with governments seeking to catch up to where they think the puck is going, the reality is that you're losing sight of why you got into that situation in the first place, and then what needs to be done in order to get out of it. When you look at the international student situation, I was discussing this with the principal a bit earlier, you're looking at a classic situation where there is a problem. If you have diploma mills that are only there for one purpose, to milk money out of international students, and then take that money and give them a half-baked, I use the word baked, solution in terms of their degrees and everything else, they're degree mills. Instead of shutting them down, which is what the provincial government should have done, the federal government turns around and says, oh, we can do more than that. We can screw up the system for everybody. Instantaneously, for every university, every college across the country, we can do this big time. And the consequences have been, frankly, from the university perspective, and from the perspective of foreign students, and from the perspective of Canada's international reputation, have been disastrous. And everybody's just walking past and whistling past and saying, oh, it's fine. Well, and people say, here's what the numbers are going to be over 1 or 2 years, and it all looks very scientific. It is not scientific. It's the opposite of scientific. But there we go. Then came the invasion of Ukraine, where naked aggression by a member of the Security Council of the United Nations was carried out and is being carried out on a daily, nightly basis, with hundreds of people being killed every week, and with thousands of soldiers dying every week. And the consequences for Ukraine, the displacement numbers are extraordinary. 9 million people displaced internally, another 6 or 7 million displaced in other countries throughout Europe and in Canada. And the sheer depravity, frankly, not only of what Russia has done, but of the justification for what has been done. And I won't take advantage of the situation by going through it piece by piece, but let's just say whatever Orwell said about propaganda and lying and rewriting history and rewriting and retelling a story and showing you the narrative has happened in spades. So that when you have the various American political figures who are basically repeating by rote what is basically Russian propaganda, it's breathtaking, but it's also awful because the consequences are so terrible. And we're now, right now, this week, learning of a proposal that's being discussed by two senior negotiators. I call them Ribbentrop and Molotov, but I mean, these are terrible things that are being done in the name of where we should be as a world. And this is happening in our world. It's happening. And finally, we have the tragedy that I just need to talk to you about because I know it's been an issue that has animated so much feeling in the country and so much feeling in our universities and colleges. And I want to address it directly. And that is the war between Israel and Hamas and the consequences of that war and the impact that it has had. I'll tell you quite simply what my view has been and what my view is, and that is that in that region, in that part of the world, there should be two states. Those two states should be called Israel and Palestine. There should be no question about our recognition of the state of Palestine, nor of our recognition of the state of Israel. Now, when you say that, a lot of people nod and say, yes, we get that. Although there are some people who say, well, there should only be one state of one kind or the other. You sort of say you have to let one of them run the place. You say, no, you have to let the two countries be separated. And actually, that was the original position of the government of Canada going back to 1947, which is when a Canadian judge, Ivan Rand, was appointed as one of the members of the committee that was looking at the question of the partition of the old British Mandate of Palestine. And he was, if you read his diaries, which are now in a well-known book about him, you'll see that he was going through a process of thinking. He wasn't sure what he thought. He hadn't been there. He didn't, he was engaging in the debate and the discussion. And he said at the end, my conclusion is these two peoples need to have their own governments and be living within borders and boundaries that are respected. And that has to be the basis of what takes place. I have to say that in taking that position as Canadian ambassador, it has made me equally unpopular in many communities because I've taken that position. And we had to shift Canada's policies in the UN so that they reflected the reality of what two states really means and why if one country decides to say, well, we think we can take more territory or we need to take more and more territory, you say, no, can't do that. There's got to be two states. There's got to be room for both states. But we're dealing with a situation in which extremists on all sides of these debates are pushing the agenda in a way that is affecting everyone in the world and everyone in the Middle East. And I keep coming back to the central point. Palestinian self-determination needs to be embraced because it is essential and the principle that people should be able to form their own government and live in a democracy. And it's got to be one of their own making. But at the same time, we've got to understand that there are profound changes that have happened in the world where it is important for Canada's position to evolve, not because our positions have dramatically shifted, but because we need to be firmer about some things precisely because of the risks that we can see on all sides of this issue. So, what did Orwell think? Well, it's interesting because Orwell was part of British society at a time when the question of Palestine was a very real question because Britain held the mandate. And so Orwell had many things to say, but one of his main concerns was, I think it's fair to say, that you can't forget the situation affecting the Arabs as you are moving towards the recognition of the State of Israel. You have to think about the long-term consequences of the exclusion of other people. And I think this came from his long view and experience. Some people have said that Orwell had streaks of anti-Semitism. I think that's true in some of his writing, and some of the things that he said, but many people who were good friends of his, and certainly one of his closest friends at the end of his life, who was Jewish and was a very active supporter of Israel, said he didn't have an ounce of anti-Semitism in him. His position was not about anti-Semitism. It was about how do we make sure that the Palestinians and the Arabs have a voice as well as the Jewish people who were going to Israel in ever increasing numbers because of the consequences of the Second World War. So I think I've taken long enough, and this is my coda, if you like, at the end. My notes say, coda on pessimism and hope. So I want to just say that there would be a tendency, I think, if you read 1984, many people read it and say, oh my God, that's horrendous. I mean, that's so bleak and dark. I mean, the novel is not an easy read. It just goes from bad to worse, and getting eaten up by rats, and the whole thing. It's a terrifying book. And you say, yes, that's right. He was trying to describe something that he felt was the nature of the world that he saw around him. It was not a pleasant English countryside of a world. It was a world with great brutality and great hardship, and in which there were a lot of bad people who were trying to do very, very bad things. But he did not conclude from that there was no hope. Even though he wrote the book at the end of his life, and he died at the age of 47, he was a young man when he died. He had tuberculosis, which was eating away at him for the last 10 years of his life. And he was smoking himself to death and living in the island of Jura all by by himself and his young adopted son, and his wife had died. I mean, you could easily concoct a story to say he was just giving up on everything and he was heading to the grave. You say, well, he was heading to the grave and he knew it, but he was not speaking in a way that said there is no hope. And here I'm going to go, as I've often done, and I'm sure some of you who follow me on social media will know that I use this phrase quite a lot. There is this wonderful conclusion to the song Anthem by Leonard Cohen, where he sings about, let the bells ring that still can ring. Forget your perfect offerings. There's a crack in everything, and that's where the light gets in. And I think at the UN you do get a sense that you go about your daily work really trying to find a way to let the light get in. Where's the light in this situation? Where is the hope? And not hope that's based on a kind of sunny optimism that says, don't worry, be happy, everything's going to be fine. But one that says, well, where are the possibilities of change? And I think if you look at all the great literature that's emerged from the Holocaust, if you think about the great writing that has emerged from the suffering of revolutions, of poverty and famine, you begin to appreciate that where people can find purpose and where people can strive for meaning, which they have to make for themselves, they will find hope. And in fact, from my perspective, I've long believed that hope is a very good working proposition. Some of you may be familiar with Pascal's bet as to why there's a God and why there's an eternal life. And Pascal, who was a brilliant writer 400 or 500 years ago, said, well, you have a choice. You either believe in God and the eternal life, or you don't. And if you believe in God and eternal life, you will live a good life. You won't do stupid things. You'll follow the commandments. You'll live an admirable life. You'll serve people well. You'll serve the public well. And everyone will be better off, including you. And if you're right, hey, you win the jackpot. You get to go to heaven. But on the other hand, if you live your life differently because you bet the other way, well, then things look very different for you if you're wrong, if you've made the wrong bet. So make the right bet. In a more modest way, I would put it this way. The trouble with deep pessimism and cynicism, which is its close cousin, is that it actually prevents you from seeing the possible. It actually stops you from taking the human footsteps that will lead you to a better place. And it prevents you from seeing the possibilities for change. And that is why I believe it's better to be an optimist than a pessimist. And it doesn't mean that in being optimistic, you are just being stupid or just being, hopefully that everything will turn out well and tomorrow is another day. No. You are creating the space in your own life that allows you to see the potential for the good and the potential for action and for the steps that you have to take in order to make the good happen. And I think that's the crucial thing. Now, the principal will perhaps not I hope he won't mind my saying, he said something to me in the discussion that was very profound. He said, you and I grew up at a time when life seemed to be going in the same direction. We thought we were going to be better off than our parents, and we thought that things were going to get better, and we were going on a trajectory from authoritarianism to democracy, and we were going in a straight line from autocracy to liberalism and pluralism and better understanding, from mystic belief to being more rational in our thinking. It all seemed to be going so well. And now we have firmly discovered what I would argue, what Orwell discovered and knew himself, was that it's not actually like that. We're not on a straight line. Things do not automatically get better. Decisions are made that have really serious bad consequences. And we lose our way in the fight against autocracy and in favor of democracy. We lose our way in thinking about how these things should be. But believe me, you cannot let these other approaches to life win out because they don't work. They're not based on values. They're not based on principles. And they take us in the opposite direction to which we need to go as a country, as people, as individuals, in our own life, as a country, and as a world. And so I think that's how we should see things. Let's bet on the future in a way that allows us to think about how we can make that future and how we can build that future. And nothing is set in stone. 1984 was a warning, not a guidepost. It's not a recipe book. It's a warning about what happens when you lose sight of the possibilities for good. And that's where I think we all should be. Thank you very much for this chance to talk to you. Thank you. We'll take this one.
Can you hear me? Okay, well, as I said, best prime minister we never had. We have time for questions, and we have mics on human mic stands, if you will, at the back corners here. Approach the mic and ask your questions. Do you want to stand here, Bob, or do you want to sit?
No, I'll stand up there.
You'll stand there, and I'll sit.
Okay, let's go. I'll look out. Yes, please, sir.
Yes, thank you. I'm anticipating your response, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there any hope for the nation of Haiti? It's in our backyard. It's a failed democracy. I don't see much going on there from our country or others to help.
Well, it's tough. I mean, Haiti is, I should have talked about it as well. I mean, there's lots of other examples I could give where, we've seen some of the forces at work that I've described. What you have in Haiti right now is a situation where armed gangs and killers and traffickers and drug dealers have taken over the control of the capital city of Port-au-Prince, which is where 4 million out of the 12 million Haitians live. And they've created complete chaos in the central city. There are now 1.4 million displaced people. And we've taken the view, Canada's actually been very involved in the evolving discussion to say that the Haitian political elite has to deal with this question. And we have profound evidence that many of the members of that elite are themselves benefiting from the drug trade and themselves benefiting from organized crime. And that's the real problem, which is one of the reasons why, as opposed to what happened before, Canada is not joining in a military intervention directly, because we firmly believe that the people who know how to solve this problem are not doing it, and they should be doing it, and they're not doing it. And that's a central problem that exists in that system at the moment. The United States has pressed the Security Council to support what they call a, quote, hybrid mission, which has been now approved by the Security Council, which will provide additional military assistance to the government of Haiti. And it responds to the fact that there's a security situation which is completely out of control, and something has to be done to get that security position improved. And I think that's necessary, and we're now trying to get countries to agree that that's what needs to be done, not only by a resolution, but also with moolah and also with people. So, and we believe that there are many African countries that would like to be able to participate in this kind of an initiative, and we think they will do so. So there's lots of activity underway, but the problems are really serious. And the one thing you learn is that as an outsider, you don't fully understand all the dimensions and challenges that face the system from inside. Very few of the outside presences in the country speak Creole, which is the national language of Haiti. People think it's French. It's not French. French is the second language in Haiti, but the first language in Haiti is Creole. And there's a very active social media underway in Haiti. There's a very active engagement of the community in what's going on, and we really believe that Haitian society has to take greater control of the situation. But the consequences of not intervening, which some people think we should not intervene, but we've been asked by pretty well everybody to do it, and I say we, I mean the outside countries, is that the violence will just get worse and worse and worse, and the situation will become literally impossible for millions of people. And the other reality, which is prompting the Americans to come out, is to say, well, what happens when that happens? Well, more and more people leave the country, and then where will they go? And what will the impact be in the Caribbean? So what we're learning as Canadians is that our own region, our broader region, if we think a little more about where we are situated geographically, is a deeply troubled place. And a lot of our efforts need to be focused on what we can do in that situation. So my answer is, are there grounds for concern? Absolutely. And is there a basis to be, say it's hopeless? Yes, you could say that if you wanted to, but the problem with that is that will only make the situation worse if you take that position.
Thank you for your comments, sir. Now, I would like to go back to the 15th of September. at Grant Hall, and I was present for a lecture delivered by Justice Rowe, who's one of the 9 Supreme Court justices in Canada.
Yes.
And as a former poor student of Confederation law, I started to appreciate that area much more as he spoke. Now, the problem he indicated at the end of his talk was that there is no world government. There may be all sorts of places where good decisions are made, but it's ultimately the purpose of the legal system to provide for enforcement somehow, and that seems to be a matter of some question. And how much does the United Nations and other parallel sorts of concerns, how much are they capable of enforcing their good intentions?
Well, that's the key issue. Let me go back to my friend Blaise Pascal, because in addition to talking about Pascal's bet, I often talk about this little brief 2 sentences that Pascal left us. The first sentence is that justice without enforcement is powerless. And the second sentence says, but power without justice is tyranny. And so, far be it from me to disagree with or take issue with a justice of the Supreme Court, but here goes. Every legal system requires enforcement. That's true. And I wouldn't say there's no enforcement on the international scale. I would say that it is complicated and it is long and it is less certain than the enforcement that we see in most effective nation states. But we need to understand the full implications of both what Blaise Pascal said and what Mr. Justice Rowe said. And that is that we need to understand that many, many countries and many people are living in a state of lawlessness and disorder and insecurity, where the behavior of the so-called authorities is unpredictable. And one of those places is not a million miles from Kingston, Ontario. So we need to understand that nobody's perfect in this situation, and that unless we uphold clearly the values of international law as we see them, and the values that permeate the entire international legal system, we're making a huge mistake, because we've actually made more progress in the 20th century and in the 21st century into building an architecture and a structure of international law. Where we have fallen behind is in enforcement, and that's not because of the idea of international law, it's because of the failure of political actors to actually enforce the agreements that they came up with. A classic example is the Paris Climate Change Treaty. There are no consequences in the treaty, which was negotiated by governments like Canada. There are no consequences for failing to meet your targets. So, I mean, I get on the scale every morning and I say, got to lose another 10, got to do this. But if I fail to meet the target, what happens? I mean, nothing happens, except I just feel fatter and less fit. But seriously, it's a universal human problem that we're looking at here. And I think one of the reasons that I'm concerned about the argument to say there is no such thing as international law because it can't always be enforced is actually wrong. There is such a thing as international law. Its weakness is that it can't always be enforced as effectively as it needs to be, but don't let that be an excuse for justifying just saying goodbye to international law. We don't really care about it, which I think would be a mistake.
Hi, I appreciated your criticism in relation to how Canada's handled the international student situation, and I was wondering what you think Canada should be doing to kind of repair the damage that's been doing there for the past year or two.
Well, I think the damage is complicated because it's not just the government of Canada, it's also the provincial governments. We're looking at a failure by both levels of government to support universities and colleges and support higher education to the extent that is now required in the kind of global economy that we're facing and we're moving into. And I think that's something which is a problem which is commonly shared. And years ago, I wrote a report on financing higher education in the province, which is, I think, still relevant today because the governments haven't done what I said they should do. So I think it's important. The reason why we took in so many international students was because, well, first of all, there's a huge demand, which is there and is always going to be there, it's very large. But secondly, because universities were not getting money, we're not allowed to raise tuition. And here I'll say to the students, I think tuition should be allowed to go up. And I think student assistance should be increased. That's been my formula from the beginning. We need to allow the universities to establish their own levels for tuition that they think are required in order to let them do the job they feel they need to do. And governments need to do everything they can to support students who can't afford to pay rates that are seen by some people as beyond their means. And that's what we need to do. We need to deal with that issue. You want to ensure access all the time. You also need to ensure excellence. So I think that when you let things go, you then react, and the pendulum in public policy, very often, you see it all the time, the pendulum swings too far. It's over here, they say we got a problem, let's do this. And you say, oh my God, it's such an overreaction. And what do they say about, for some people, if everything looks like a nail, you do, whatever that phrase is, I can't remember the expression, but you just use a hammer every time because you think it's this, that's the nail that sticks out, we got to whack it. And I just think it's important for us to understand that it may be politically popular to kind of rule out some things or to make some decisions to say we're going to get these numbers. But you got to think through the consequences of what you're doing and whether there isn't a better way to say, yeah, do we need a housing strategy for students? Absolutely. Do we need an affordable housing strategy? Absolutely. But I don't think immigration is the core of our problem with having a housing strategy. I mean, as Jean very kindly said, I was part of a government that decided we're going to deal with the housing issue in a big way, and no other government, either provincial or federal, has done as much on that front and on that score as we did in a 5-year period. But we were prepared to ride a higher deficit in order to get there, and many people criticized us for doing that. But I think, frankly, in the absence of anything else, it was an important step forward.
Thank you very much, and I have to say it's so inspiring that you bring a sense of humor after 5 years at the UN. So thank you for that. My question is, there's another genocide going on right now, and our Prime Minister was just in the country trying to, rustle up some bucks to benefit Canada from people who have been directly implicated in that genocide in Sudan. So is that pragmatism, or is that a betrayal of the very values you were just describing?
Well, I think it's, to be honest, I think it's complicated. I have advocated within the government to say we shouldn't back away from our concerns about human rights, but we also shouldn't back away from our willingness to engage with countries with which we disagree, whether it's Turkey or Saudi Arabia or the Gulf states or China. It's important for us to be able to engage with those countries, and we can't ignore the fact that they are going to be important sources of economic investment and economic activity. But nor should we back away from what needs to happen in Sudan. And I think there's a responsibility that we all share, frankly. I did an exit interview with one of the papers and said, we need to understand how challenging the situation in Sudan is today. We also need to understand more about the history of what is it that created this level of conflict this fast. And I think in many situations we're very loath to fully understand and appreciate how deeply embedded some of the sources of ethnic conflict and other conflicts that are in place really are. So if you're saying, if I was Prime Minister, would I go to Abu Dhabi? Yes, I would, but I'd also want to have a candid conversation with the UAE about what is actually happening in the Horn of Africa, what is their perspective, and what is frankly, their excuse, and to try to push the argument and the discussion so that we aren't afraid to raise those issues, but we're not necessarily saying we're not going to engage. I say this without embarrassment, I spent the first 2 years I was in New York trying to have having a conversation with successive ambassadors from Saudi Arabia to say, we had a problem and we've got to get over it because we can't keep on ignoring each other in terms of the perspectives that we have on the need for engagement. But I really do believe that we shouldn't be backing away from naming the causes and finding out more about why they are what they are. Yeah.
Hello, thank you. So I recognize your fidelity to the more morally defensible principles of international law. And I also, I do think I agree with you that postmodernism or epistemic relativism, I think you called it post-truth environment, is problematic as per your Trumpian anecdote. But I guess the question is, if there is a series of universal virtues and international law is a codification of said universal virtues, who should decide what those are? Historically, it has been the West, often to detrimental consequences. So how do we sort of navigate that?
Good question. I think the answer is that we now have enough presence of all countries in the United Nations that the standards and values that countries can agree on can become an important basis for international discussion. And I would just say, like in defense, for example, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was negotiated in the late 1940s, that there were countries present that had a lot to do with the wording of the document and with the some of the direction of the thinking in the document that I think impacted the final draft. But you're quite right when you say that it's important that the principles should be more universally agreed upon. But I would take issue with one premise of your statement, and that is the suggestion that some human values are not universally seen as values. I can't think of very many world religions or global systems of philosophy or value that would say things like greed is a really good thing, murdering people is perfectly okay and normal and fine. I think that there are values that actually are universal. I think the foundation of all of them are, to sum them up in some way, one of them is the importance of human dignity as a universal principle, the dignity of the human personality, which is where I think our concepts of freedom and our concepts of how people should be treated really stem from. And I think some of the other concepts that are even more widely shared in Eastern philosophies around humility and perspective and thinking in a longer term way about the consequences of what we do. And those are values that I think are not confined to the West. And I think there are many Western values that are very time-bound. For example, on economic principles or economic theories, I would say, well, yeah, but that's not exactly a universal practice. So don't make the mistake of extrapolating from your own ideology, your own view, what you think everybody else should be forced to do. So there's a point there that I think you make that is important. But again, the difficulty of the effort doesn't mean that it's not worth the effort. It just means that it requires more subtlety and it requires more reflection to actually get to a better place.
Hello, I just have a question about your thoughts or insights on the, to me, increased use of the notwithstanding clause, such as in Alberta, Quebec, as well as recently I heard that Ford mentioned possibly invoking it to make the sex offender registry public.
Again, thank you for the question. I mean, I think I know for sure that I'm the only person in the room who was present when the Constitution was, the last successful round of patriation was negotiated. And my last vote in the House of Commons before I came back the second time was to pass the patriation of the Constitution with the Charter. The discussion around the notwithstanding clause was really interesting when it took place, because it was really about whether we needed some kind of ultimate safety valve that could be used by a provincial jurisdiction or the federal government to express the common view of Parliament or of a provincial legislature about something that would be done very discreetly and very rarely, and would then have to be responded to and justified, and would lead to a kind of a dialectical relationship between the courts and the Parliament about what should or could be done. The fact of the matter is the notwithstanding clause was the only way out of the conundrum that we were in with respect to needing, according to the Supreme Court, needing more provincial buy-in. And so it was the product of that relationship. So what I think or don't think about the notwithstanding clause, I would have been much happier if it had not been there, and I would be much happier if we just had the Charter there fully embedded in the Constitution. And when people would say things like Mr. Trudeau said to me, Mr. Trudeau Sr. said to me when a group of us went to see him about constitutional change, when at that time he wanted the opinion of the NDP, and we gave a little talk about why we needed to put in what became Section 35 of the Constitution on Indigenous rights and freedoms, and interpretation of the Constitution accordingly. And he said, as Jean said, he did say, Junior, what do you think that means? What's the meaning of that? And I said, well, what does freedom of assembly mean? We can't decide what the implications are of this, because the courts will decide eventually, and ultimately that will be a reflection of what evolves in a society. And he said to me, well, initially his reaction to the recognition of Aboriginal treaties was, I don't want to do that in the Constitution. And we said, well, if you want our support, you're going to have to do that. So there was an element of politics in all of it. But I do think that the use of the notwithstanding clause should never become a habit, and it's best left alone for the most crushing and disastrous of consequences of a court decision. And everybody says, how the hell they come up with that idea, which happens from time to time. But even then, I don't think it should be used. And the argument that it's only there to be used whenever we decide to use it is actually incorrect. And I don't think that's the purpose of the clause. Take one or two more, yeah?
Hi, Bob. My name's Armando, and I'm a youth advocate for the Ontario NDP and for young people. What I remember most about learning about your legacy is the fact that you were premier, that you've held the first and only NDP government in the early 1990s. Unfortunately, it was only one term, but as I read deeper and deeper, it was such a interesting and crucial moment where there was a recession and there was a crisis going on in the country. So now politics has changed, of course, dramatically from the early 1990s to 2025. Now, present day, where the Ontario NDP sits is a part of I would say it is similar to the federal NDP in the fact that our values are kind of blurred, and we have to try to piece our values and piece things together. So what is something that you see if you look at the Ontario NDP today, or the NDP as a whole, what is something that you would do to change, or what is something that you would, if you would give wisdom or something that the NDP or the Ontario NDP alike can do to regain government or get towards government for the federal NDP?
Well, I mean, first of all, thank you for the question. I think you're the first New Democrat in 20 years who's asked me such a question. I'm serious. I mean, I would say, I mean, this is not unique, but I would say to you what I said to my own party throughout the 80s and the 90s, and that was, you have to embrace the modern world in a way that makes people feel that you really understand that we can't go back to some ideal economic and social past, but that we have to work our way fairly pragmatically. I think in Ottawa today, and I would say certainly at Queen's Park, there is huge room on the left and in the center. There's huge room for reasoned, thoughtful ways of trying to move the party beyond being in opposition to being in government. But I think that, you know, my criticism of the NDP was, one of the reasons that I left, was because I felt that the party fundamentally was more interested in being an effective opposition than being in government. And where we have been in government, look at the examples. Wab Kinew in Manitoba, still with a huge approval rating, higher than any other premier. You look at British Columbia, where the party is still embracing the need to be pragmatic. You look at the opposition in Saskatchewan and Alberta, where the party has really embraced pragmatism and is trying to come up with ideas and approaches that are going to be seen as ready for government. My own sense is that in the case of Ontario and federally, there's a lot of New Democrats who are psychologically much happier being in opposition. The joke I used to tell after I became premier was that probably, you know, one thing that all New Democrats had in common on election night was, one, they were really proud of the result, and secondly, they'd like a recount, because they're not necessarily embracing some of the very tough things you have to do when you're in government. Governing is not about choosing between really good things and really bad things. In my case, it was about choosing the least bad thing we could do in the circumstance, which is how we came to some conclusions that people say, why would you do such a thing? Why would you do that? The social contract, for example. Well, in the circumstances, it felt like the least bad thing we could do. Maybe we were wrong. Maybe that was not the right answer. But that was the conclusion that we reached as a government. And as soon as we were defeated, there were a lot of New Democrats who said, thank God we can finally go back to pursuing perfection, because we're so much more comfortable being Gideon's army. The smaller, the better. And I've never accepted that view about our party. But when people look at me and say, well, why did your values change? I said, my values have not changed. On social and economic policy, my principles have not changed at all. What has changed is my sense of which party is likely to be able to form government effectively in the face of other alternatives which are even worse, and then figure out where do we go from there. And that's, I think, what's the reason that I joined the Liberal Party. But that doesn't stop me from saying I like New Democrats. I like the New Democratic Party. I'm very proud of having been premier. I'm very proud of having led the Ontario New Democratic Party. There are many New Democrats who would rather I wasn't around. In fact, when I came into the House of Commons as a Liberal, there was a whole sort of discomfort from all the New Democrats who were elected. And I said, I know how you feel. You feel kind of like your first husband has just moved in next door, and you're really uncomfortable with what that means.
So thank you for being here. My question is like more personal. Was getting your law degree a long-term goal for you, or is after getting your master's you felt like something was missing? And my second question, what advice would you give someone considering following the same path as you did?
Well, if you read my autobiography, you'll know that it took a nervous breakdown for me to decide to go to law school. and I say that quickly, but not facetiously. I had a career that seemed to be going in a certain direction, and I finished my MPhil and was thinking I was going to do more work on my thesis. And then as time went on, I began to feel deeper and more profound senses of uncertainty, anxiety, and depression. And that went on for a couple of years, and it was a very difficult period for me, but also for everybody around me and for my parents and family who were bewildered by what had happened, because it just seemed that I was just on this path and what the hell happened. And it took me a long time to really try to understand myself better and to try to think about the career path and the path of my vocation that would actually meet my needs better, maybe more me, where I could be more me. And one of the first things I had to decide was, where was I going to live? So I was living in England, and I decided that that's not where I wanted to live forever. And I needed to come home to Canada, and that was part of what was going on. And another part of it was, actually, it was Isaiah Berlin who said to me when I was struggling, and I went to see him. He said, "You're not happy. You're not happy. What is it?" And I was extremely incoherent. But I said, "I always thought I wanted to be an academic." And he said, "Stop right there. You don't need to be an academic if you don't want to be an academic." He said, "The happiest time in my life was I felt most useful was when I was working as a civil servant in World War II. And I was based in Washington, and my job was to, get involved and try to tell Churchill what was going on in Washington because of that relationship. And my job was to work with, if you like, civil society, government officials at a very kind of different level." And he said, "And I've never lost the taste for government and for practical politics." And then he looked at me and he said, "I think that's where you belong." Which was very perceptive, which is another way of saying you don't have the depth to be a good academic. So maybe you should become a lawyer. I later gave him an honorary degree at the University of Toronto. The university asked me who should we give a degree to. I said, "Give one to Isaiah Berlin, because he's one of the reasons that I'm here." And seriously, I think you have to find your own way. Everyone has to decide for themselves, what is it that fits me best, and how can I continue to contribute? There's no right or wrong answer. So if you say to me, "Should I do what you did?" my answer would be no. Do what you want to do. And I can't tell you what you want to do. I can only tell you that I concluded that law gave me the opportunity to engage with people at a very personal level and at a very practical level. It also allowed me to be clearer minded in my own thinking about how things actually worked in practice as opposed to in theory. Although there's a richness in legal theory and a richness in becoming a lawyer that means you don't have to abandon completely your sense of ideas. So that's why I chose the path that I did. And it allowed me to integrate into Canada better. It allowed me to engage with people on a daily, practical basis. I'd done some of that work in legal aid. The first job I had in England, first real job I had was working in a community law and housing center in North London for 6 months before I came back to go to law school. And so that has sort of been the pattern that I've more or less tried to follow ever since then. We got one more question, briefly.
Sure.
Sir.
Okay, one more.
Well, ladies first. We'll take you, sir, as well. We'll get the two in quickly. Why don't you both ask your questions and I'll answer both of them.
Maybe not so much as a question, but something summative. As I sit here with family and I look at your title, The World We Are Living In, and I think of family members on the heels of Remembrance Day who, in the context of the Second World War, landed on Juno Beach with a passion to fight authoritarian regimes, 4 years in the prisons of Hong Kong, horrible atrocities, again, to fight fascism. And it brings me to the word at the beginning of your speech that will stay with me as a retired school teacher, which was intergenerational. And so then I look to you, and you are our future. And what I take away with Mr. Ray's comments, what I'm daunted reading the news in the Globe, through CBC, through BBC, through wherever, is that what we can't walk away from as you move forward is to maintain values as a Canadian, wherever you end up, and a sense of integrity. Let that be what guides you, and then perhaps someday in your career, you'll be in a room like this, full, with great admiration and respect for a wonderful Canadian statesperson.
Wow. Sure.
How big a threat do you think the U.S. is to our sovereignty?
That will definitely be the last question.
It also could be the last answer of my career, but I have two competing thoughts, which I can't fully resolve in my mind. The first one is that the United States has taken a path that is truly dramatically different from anything we have lived with as a country for decades, if not centuries. And the comments by the president, comments by the American ambassador, other comments that have been made, anybody should not just say, well, there's no problem here, let's just drive by. It's just a blip in the discussion. You know, this can't be permanent, this cannot. And the other thought that I have is that in the America that I've come to know in the last 5.5 years, there are tens of millions of people who think the same way I do. I could give this discussion, I could have this discussion in university campuses across the United States. People would be in strong agreement with what I'm saying. The professors would be. Many of the other people would be. There's a whole group of people in the United States who take a similar view. And we can only hope and pray that eventually they come back and their view prevails. But for the time being, I think we have to take the threats very seriously. And that has an impact on a lot of other things that we need to think about, not just trade, but when you have countries that say that we can take a boat down in the water and kill everybody on board that boat because we believe that, you know, they're carrying drugs, you say to yourself, well, wait a minute, does that mean that any Canadian police officer can just suddenly blow up a car because they think that car might have drugs in it? I think the Supreme Court of Canada would have something to say about that. And we go down the list. So what does that mean for Haiti? What does that mean for other interventions? What does it mean for Greenland? What does their thought about Greenland mean for us? Do we just set all that stuff aside and say, no, nothing going on here, just drive by, don't worry about it? I don't think we can afford to do that. I think we have to recognize that the threat of the current government of the United States is very real. And if we don't think it's impactful, we're mistaken. And that's what I think is making the policy discussion about, well, what do we do? So the conversation I was having with you about, well, what do we do? Do we disengage from the United States? No, we can't. Do we have to make a commercial arrangement with the United States? It would be great if we could. Do we act pragmatically in doing so? Yes. But at the same time, we can't remain silent in the face of policy decisions and political decisions and economic decisions that are so hurtful to our interest and hurtful to global interests. And so we can't afford to just say, well, we're not going to say anything about anything because that might affect our ability to establish a commercial relationship with the United States. And that's where I draw a personal line. I say, no, I'm not going to be shut up because I think that some things that are happening are actually hurting. I mean, the USAID decision, the USAID decision was desperately hurtful to thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people all around the world. And it's not an example that should be followed by anybody, and certainly not by our government. It won't be followed by our government. So yeah, I do take it seriously. But I don't think the answer is just to kind of panic or say, I'm never going to go to the United States again. I said, no, you can't live your life only in protest with your hand on the horn. You can't do that. You just have to say, we are going to continue to express ourselves in ways that we think are constructive and based on principle and based on values. And that sometimes leads to a tough discussion. But frankly, there's a tough discussion that has to happen. And we are being treated, at the moment, we're being treated pretty badly. And I think we need to be able to express ourselves, Canadians, with our American friends and say, why are you doing this? I don't know about you, but whenever I talk to Americans, the first thing look at me and says, where are you from? Canada. I am really sorry. And I say, not half as sorry as we are. And you know, what are you going to do about it? Because it's affecting you as much as it's affecting us. And that's my last point. Don't give up hope on America. Don't become anti-American. Don't embrace the line that says, you know, this is this capitalist, fascist development. Don't go there. Don't go there. There is a democratic urge in the United States and a democratic foundation in the United States which should never, ever be forgotten. It has to be revived, it has to be nurtured, it has to be supported. But we should never believe for a moment that somehow we can go off on our own and forget about the fact that our economic and social and personal interests are closely tied to those of our American neighbor. Thanks very much, folks.
We have two more pieces of business to conclude. I'd like to invite Aisha Atif, Student Executive Co-Chair, to thank Bob.
Hi, everyone. So on behalf of the School of Policy Studies, I want to extend our sincere thanks to the Honourable Bob Ray for being here with us today and for sharing your thoughtful and deeply, deeply grounded insights. For years, you have been one of Canada's most respected voices. Across public service, across diplomacy, across advocacy, and most recently as Canada's representative to the United Nations. It is an honor for us that your first public address since retiring from that role has been here with the policy studies community. Your career embodies the values we strive to learn here every single day: honesty, humility, and a commitment to strengthening democratic institutions all around the world. For many of us preparing to enter public service, you have been a defining example of what it means to serve with integrity and courage. Hearing you speak here with us today reminded us that public policy is never just about institutions or about systems. It's about responsibility, it's about people, and it's about the choices we make when the stakes are high. Your insights have not only informed us, but genuinely inspired the next generation of young Canadians who hope to serve their communities with the same dedication you've had throughout your career. Thank you for taking the time to share your experience with us and for your decades to service in Canadian and global diplomacy. We are truly grateful for your generosity and, most importantly, for your commitment to invest in the future of this profession. Thank you so much.
Very well said. So Bob, I noticed you didn't wear a tie today. Right. And so the gift you're getting is one of the coveted Queen's University neckties, like the one I'm wearing. And I want to tell you, Bob, you can wear that tie at U of T. It's okay. It's okay to wear it at U of T. Okay, so our final event today, I'd like to ask the Dean of Arts and Science, Dr. Bob Lemieux, to make an announcement.
Thank you. First of all, Bob, thank you for being here. Thank you for all the wisdom that you've imparted upon us. Thank you for the remarks that you made about optimism. Certainly, I think we all appreciate it. Optimism is at a low point right now in the post-secondary sector with all the challenges that we're facing, the chronic underfunding, and now, of course, the immigration issues and the student visas, the straw that's sort of breaking the camel's back, I guess. But I would like to think that there's a lot of reasons why we need to be optimistic at Queen's. We're probably better positioned than many other universities to come out of these challenges in a good position. And having you here with us today is one of the reasons why we need to stay optimistic. And so my announcement is related to Bob being here today and perhaps a few more times in the future. And it has to do with the Donald Matthews Faculty Fellow in Global Policy Study, Global Public Policy. So the fellowship, the same Donald Matthews that has endowed this lecture series, was established in 2006 by Donald Matthews, engineering class in 1950. The fellowship, which is hosted by the School of Policy Studies and which is held for 3 years, is designed to be a bridge builder between academic theory and real-world practice. It brings senior, world-class scholars and practitioners to Queen's to share their direct experience and expertise with students and faculty. The list of past fellows include notable public servants and leaders such as Don Drummond, Margaret Biggs, Daniel Brandt, and Hugh Siegel. And I'm pleased to announce this afternoon that Bob Ray will be joining this elite group. His distinguished career directly embodies the fellowship's bridge builder mandate. Above and beyond the many roles he has played at the provincial and federal levels, his recent role as Canada's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations and president of the United Nations Economic and Social Council placed him at the center of the global public policy issues that are the fellowship's focus. So we're very privileged to have Bob joining the School of Policy Studies as Matthews Fellow. And I do have an envelope here. It's not a check. But it is a letter of offer. I understand that you've accepted the offer verbally, but here's the letter, and I do hope that you're going to sign it back. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Well, let me just say, from my point of view, and in front of all of you, I don't know exactly what the offer is, but I'm accepted anyway. I express great appreciation to all of you. And I think all I can say is Via Rail is going to become my best friend. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.